In this episode, Dale Cook and I discuss the potential impact of the new administration on the FDA and public health regulations. We're going to discover if the Trump administration will bring any changes at all. Will there be a decrease in enforcement? What is the impact of influential people? The latest update on intended use. What is the government's role in addressing misinformation? How do you respond to misinformation at the clinical level? And then finally, how should the FDA respond to misinformation? Again, our guest is Dale Cook, president at Philly Cook Consulting, and let's get into it. In the period between Trump being elected and before he's come into power, just to be clear, we don't expect any changes. Is that correct? Nothing's going to change once President Trump comes into power.
Yeah. The really interesting thing here is that it very much is a redux, which we have not had in my lifetime. And what I mean by that is, back in 2016, we were in a circumstance where we had a Democratic administration leaving office and Trump as the president-elect coming into office. And now again, 8 years later, we have a Democratic administration leaving office and President-elect Trump coming into office. So, history is prelude. I go back and I look at what happened in that period between the November election in 2016 and the inauguration in January. And, the first thing that leaps out to me is, during that period, we got the 21st Century Cures Act passed. That happened on that Friday after Thanksgiving, where Congress is always incredibly active and passes massive pieces of legislation. But that was a major landmark. And of course, FDA then rushed out the door some very significant moves in December and January, in part, in response to the 21st Century Cures Act. But in part, this is just what happens when you have a transition from one party to another occupying the White House. The previous administration always pushes out their highest priority items to try to, ensure that things get done.
So do you expect, as we move forward, enforcement to drop because there's very little to depend on as we continue?
With regard to FDA's issuance of letters, et cetera, what FDA would say is they have never taken an enforcement action based on a guidance. They have taken an enforcement action based on the underlying regulations and a failure to meet those regulatory requirements. And so with regard to things like one click, there was never any statement from the FDA, nor did anything in regulations say that there was some sort of one click exception to, the regs. And the regs, admittedly, very, very difficult to apply to that context, but on their surface, they pretty clearly said that what was going on didn't, or rather that applying the regs to that context, it simply didn't meet the requirements of the regulations. Admittedly, it's really, really difficult, if not impossible, to meet those requirements in that context. But that was, that was FDA's basis for the enforcement there.
There's course of dealing at that point.
At that point, yes. And, why did they suddenly do that in 2009? Well, again, change of administration, right? So do I expect there to be a reduction in enforcement overall? Yes, I do. I don't actually take DOGE seriously in this context. And the reason I don't is because so far as I can tell, it has no legal authority or basis.
I was watching the show The Diplomat on Netflix last night. For those of you who don't watch it,
very good.
It's a great show. One of the things the woman says to the diplomat, if you will, is that you listen to the last person who was in the room. And Trump's been accused of the same thing. He's had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. come in and say, we should get rid of vaccines. And then the president-elect come in and one day say, I'm not against vaccines. And the next day say, I am against vaccines. And it seems to change, which either means that he's still learning more, or it means that some other person came in the room and spoke to him. My questions for you is, how do you react to any of that? And do you worry that there will be more misinformation because of the influential people in the president-elect's orbit right now?
Yes, I worry that there will be more misinformation being propagated and pushed out, potentially even by the government itself. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a history of pushing out misinformation. Not every single thing that he says is misinformation, but a significant amount of the stuff that he says about vaccines and a connection to autism, for example, is straight up misinformation that has been debunked multiple times in multiple places. And I very much worry that vaccination is going to plummet, that we're going to see either an attempt to revoke the approval of certain vaccines, or an effort to minimize the encouragement of vaccinations. Not just FDA, but a lot of other parts of the federal government, CDC, NIH, et cetera, undertake efforts to get the word out about the need to vaccinate. So I'm very worried about that and what's going to happen there.
What has been the update, according to you, around intended use?
2017 was when FDA, just before the new administration came in, published a new final regulation. The Trump administration, immediately upon assuming office, paused that. But then they went through with a new version of an update. And so we did get a new version of the intended use regulation, right? So that did come to fruition.
I have a problem with a government agency that is specifically told not to get into this, talking about the misuse of ivermectin. As a pharmacist, I think has no value. But as an individual citizen, I go, it's not the role of the agency to decide the use or inappropriate use of ivermectin.
Yeah, I mean, these sorts of questions about the role of government in responding to misinformation is it's a thorny issue. And as a rule of thumb, I don't like the idea of there being a single arbiter of the truth telling me what it's okay to believe. People who have no expertise whatsoever, who are actively promoting things that will harm people, then I think it's completely appropriate for FDA or other relevant agencies to say, please don't do this, right? Don't believe this misinformation. I want there to be constraints on what they do, but I don't want to simply hope that the right thing gets done.
I would argue that having someone go out there and basically challenge and prevent scientists from talking to other scientists about this is outside the scope of what the FDA can do. It's a violation of the First Amendment. In the same way, allowing a doctor to go, I'm making this up, go onto Fox News and say, use ivermectin. I don't know if that actually happened, just to be clear. But if he did, that's not within the scope of the FDA to stop a doctor from saying just that.
The concern with misinformation is not so much around, the scientists talking to each other. It's around, these platforms that are just out there for the public. And there absolutely are specialists on there, but knowing who they are and who's trustworthy and who's not is extremely difficult. Industry needs to step up, right? They need to be providing good, accurate, truthful information about their products.
This actually was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that is not your role, FDA, stop it. And the court actually went after them for that.
And that's the challenge of saying, what do you do in these situations? And FDA there is clearly trying to combat that misinformation. And I know that the a court has, said that they shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
By the same token, that was a widely prevalent meme going around about, encouraging the use of veterinary medicines in human beings. And of course, as you know, that's a really difficult topic for all sorts of reasons.
Any parting words
for people who care about FDA and care about public health? The next few years will be an incredibly important time to pay attention. I think there will be really significant changes. I think we will probably see a much more activist attempt to radically alter the agency. And if you think the agency has been seriously out of line for a long time and needs to be brought to heel, then you'll probably be very happy with what will be attempted. If, on the other hand, you think the FDA has largely been doing an outstanding job with limited resources and you'd love to see it do even more, then I think you're going to be deeply unhappy for the next few years.
Thank you so much for being part of this. I can't wait to do part 2.
Thank you, Darshan.
For assistance with your advertising compliance needs, feel free to contact us at darshan@kulkarnilawfirm.com.